On the 22nd floor of a towering glass building, where the city lights shimmered like scattered diamonds across the night sky, a man sat alone in his office. The world knew him as Alexander Hayes, one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. He was the kind of man who commanded boardrooms, closed billion-dollar deals with a glance, and never allowed emotions to cloud his decisions. To his employees, he was sharp, cold, and unreachable, someone too consumed by success to ever be touched by something as simple as human warmth. Yet that evening, the clock ticked past 9, and Alexander's empire felt emptier than ever. For it was his birthday, and not a single soul in his world had remembered. He stared at the untouched dinner on his desk, a meal delivered by his assistant hours ago. The candles on the small cake that came with it were long extinguished. Birthdays had lost their meaning years ago, ever since he had buried the only two people who had ever celebrated them with him, his parents. Since then, celebrations felt like a cruel reminder of what he had lost, and so he worked through each one, convincing himself he was too busy to care. Yet, deep inside, a quiet ache reminded him that loneliness had grown roots in his life, stronger and deeper than he dared to admit. The office building had grown silent. Most of his employees had gone home to their families. The cleaners had begun their nightly rounds, moving through corridors with quiet efficiency. That was when Alexander heard the softest knock on his door, a sound so unexpected at that hour that he raised his head, surprised. Without waiting for permission, the door creaked open, and in stepped the last person he thought he would ever see in his office that night, a little girl, no older than 7. Her dark hair was tied into 2 uneven braids, and her oversized sweater looked as though it belonged to someone else, perhaps a sibling or even her mother. In her tiny hands, she carried a paper plate with a piece of cake, slightly squashed on one side but carefully balanced as if it were a treasure. Her big brown eyes sparkled with innocence as she walked toward his desk. "I saved you some cake, mister," she said in a small but confident voice. "It's your birthday, right? Birthdays aren't meant to be alone." For a long moment, Alexander just stared at her, unable to process the scene. No one had called him Mr. in years, only Sir, Mr. Hayes, or CEO. He cleared his throat, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "Who are you? How did you even get in here?" The little girl didn't flinch. She set the plate carefully on his desk and looked up at him, as though she had every right to be there. "My mom cleans the offices here," she explained softly. "She said I could sit in the break room while she works, but I saw the lady at the front desk bring you a cake earlier. You didn't eat it, so I thought maybe you don't like cake. But I had some from the break room downstairs. I saved you this piece because nobody should be alone on their birthday." Her words landed like an arrow straight to Alexander's chest. Something inside him cracked, a part of him he had locked away for years. He tried to find the right response, but his throat tightened. He had not cried in decades, not since he was a boy standing by his parents' graves, vowing that emotions would only make him weak. But now, with this little girl looking at him with such purity, he felt the sting of tears threatening to escape. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand across his face. "You don't even know me," he murmured, his voice thick. The girl shrugged in the way only children could, as though life's greatest truths were the simplest. "You don't have to know someone to be kind to them." Her innocence disarmed him. He glanced at the cake on the plate, a small, messy slice, frosted in bright pink. It wasn't from a luxury bakery or a high-end restaurant, but somehow, it felt more valuable than any gift he had ever received. He picked up the fork, hesitated, and then took a bite. The sweetness melted on his tongue, and with it, something inside him melted too. The girl beamed, as though his eating the cake was the greatest victory of her life. She clapped her little hands together. "See, now it's a real birthday. My teacher says birthdays are for smiling and making wishes. Did you make one?" He almost laughed, a sound rusty from disuse. "I don't make wishes," he said softly. "Why not?" she asked, tilting her head. "Wishes are free. Maybe if you make one, it'll come true." For the first time in years, Alexander allowed himself to close his eyes and imagine. What would he even wish for? He had money, power, everything people chased. Yet none of it had filled the hollow ache in his chest. And so, in silence, he made a wish, not for another deal, not for success, but for something much simpler. To feel human again, to have someone in his life who saw him not as a CEO, but just as a man. When he opened his eyes, the little girl was watching him with a knowing smile. "You made one, didn't you?" she whispered, as though she could read his heart. Alexander cleared his throat and gave a small nod. Maybe I did. That was the night something began to change. He walked the girl back to the break room, where her mother was finishing her cleaning shift. The woman looked embarrassed and apologetic when she saw her daughter with him, but Alexander only smiled, surprising even himself. He thanked the child for the cake and told her mother she had given him the best birthday gift he had ever received. In the weeks that followed, Alexander found himself thinking about that little girl more often than he expected. Her simple words, "You don't have to know someone to be kind," echoed in his mind during late nights in the office, during tense board meetings, and even as he stood in front of mirrors where his reflection seemed less empty than before. Something in him had been unlocked, and once opened, it refused to shut again. He began noticing things he had long ignored. The tired smile of his assistant, the janitor working quietly in the background, the security guard who always greeted him at the door. For years, he had treated these people as invisible, but now he found himself stopping, asking how their days were, listening to their stories. His employees noticed the change too. The once cold and untouchable CEO now carried warmth in his voice, and though he remained a man of discipline and drive, there was a softness to him that hadn't been there before. Months later, on another late evening, he walked past the break room and found the little girl again, sitting with a book while her mother cleaned. She looked up, her face lighting up. "Mister, did your wish come true?" Alexander paused, then smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "It did, because you reminded me how." He sat with her for a while that night, listening as she told him about school, about the cat she wanted to adopt, about the stories she loved to read. For a man who had lived his life surrounded by numbers, contracts, and deals, her chatter was a kind of music he hadn't realized he had been missing. And so, what began as a small slice of cake shared on a lonely birthday became the turning point of his life. He didn't just gain a memory, he regained his humanity, one that success had stolen from him. All because a little girl with braids believed that nobody should be alone on their birthday. Sometimes, the most powerful transformations come not from wealth or grand gestures, but from small acts of kindness, the kind that pierce through the hardest armor and remind us that we are, after all, only human. And for Alexander Hayes, the man who hadn't cried in years, that night proved that even the coldest hearts can be warmed by the simplest gift, a child's love, wrapped in a slice of cake.